In this video, I thought I'd sit down and just relate a few thoughts that I had been having. And these are thoughts that were prompted by um, a few of the comments that were left on my last video about medieval law by one of my subscribers. These comments mostly had to do with this particular subscriber's belief that anarchy or anarchism, anarcho-capitalism, as a system of social organization would that it would not, for various biological, evolutionary, or Darwinian reasons, not be sustainable. He sort of expressed his belief that people tend to naturally gravitate toward figures of authority, and so for this reason, the formation of states is inevitable. Now, I had replied to his comments myself, and I think the replies were decent enough, and I said more or less what I wanted to say. But since that time, over the last few days, I've just sort of been having, thoughts about this, and I thought I would expand a bit more deeply on this topic and explain why it is that I think it is possible to actually to create a functioning, lasting anarcho-capitalist society if if libertarians do their job, right? If they do the work necessary for that to happen, if they persuade enough people ideologically, if they win them over in one way or another, if they somehow manage to show them that this sort of system will will work. Um, but before I do that, there's actually one other thing that I would like to say in relation to medieval law that I did not say in my last video because I really couldn't find a way to fit it into the video in a way that would be coherent, in a way that would mesh nicely with what I had sort of selected to be the general overriding theme of that first medieval law video. That theme, of course, was what I took to be the single greatest check on the tendency of the state to expand and grow in power that has ever been devised, and the failure of that check. And that check that I'm referring to is, of course, the right of resistance. But there's another feature of medieval law that I think is very important, very interesting, that I'd just like to take a brief moment to discuss before I go into that other intended topic. Now, before I say anything else, I should make clear that despite all of the good things that I had said about the medieval legal system in that video, I in no way intend to idealize that system. I am not trying to romanticize it. I am not trying to imply that it was, if not perfect, then at least as close to perfect as is reasonably attainable. I am not romanticizing it in any way. There were certainly problems with it, and one of the things I'd like to discuss now is one of those problems, because despite all of the good things that can be said about the nature of the early medieval state and how it was constrained by ideas about Germanic common law and by the church, there are still certain problems, and they illustrate very well the sort of central problem with all states and why something like minarchism is unsustainable. Alright, so I had explained in my last video that at the center of the medieval conception of law was God. And from that came this belief in the law as this objective, transcendent legal order that stood above everyone else, king included, and thereby also came the belief that each individual, if he felt in his own conscience that the king had improperly performed his duty, if he had acted contrary to the law, if he had done something wrong, it was his right to resist the king. But there is another important facet to medieval law, and that was the belief, and this was sort of a strange belief that seems to have been held a priori by all medieval people, that the law was old, and all law, all true law, was not only old, but also, by virtue of its being old, was good. Now let me explain what I mean by that. Um, Old law was really traditional law. It was taken to be, the laws of our fathers, so to speak. That they were laws which had stood the test of time and which had served the ancestors of whatever, people happened to be employing them in the Middle Ages at the time. And because they had served them well and had evolved in this natural and organic way, they were seen as being applicable and you know, well functioning enough to serve social needs adequately. So, but this idea of law as being old, of true law as being old, led to a few strange things, because there were a few very old customs which despite their great age, were seen by at least some people during the Middle Ages as being, truly unlawful and in conflict with their consciences. So age did not automatically confer, legitimacy to some legal custom. To give an obvious example, there was a medieval thinker by the name of Eike von Repgau who strongly opposed slavery. And he had written that because slavery had been around for countless centuries, it had acquired the appearance of law. It had acquired the gloss of law. It seemed legitimate because it was so old, but in actual fact it was not. And he went on to postulate that before the emergence of slavery within human society, there had existed a time where the even older, truer, more authentic law had prevailed. And this was a time without slavery. And so the introduction of slavery, despite having been something that happened countless eons ago, was, according to him, a perversion of the true law. So, if you see law, as the early medievals did, as being something that was, almost by definition, old and good, anything which conflicted with the individual conscience must always be regarded as something that diverted the law from its proper channels. And so, in theory, you could only have restoration of the law and never actual innovation or changes in the law. Now, of course, you did have changes in the law. Different laws, different common rulings emerged as people's senses of morality changed and evolved over time. But this was always held as not as being an innovation in the law, but as being a reversion to the old true law of the past. And now this fact about how medieval law was conceived actually did have an important effect on the state, because although I had said in my last video that the state did not really create law, that it did not legislate in the way that we think of states doing so today. And although this is largely true because law did evolve organically out of this body of custom, there is one small facet of law which in fact was provided by the state, and that's royal charters. Now, all royal charters really served to do was to confer certain privileges on somebody. They would say, a certain person has a right to some specific thing, and they would specify these sorts of arrangements. So all state-issued law, so-called, was not really law created for the regulation or benefit of a community, but it existed to confer privilege or to establish somebody's perceived rights to something. Now, the medieval conception of law as being old that I described meant that for all royal charters, the older charter, the charter issued by an older emperor, an emperor, further back in the past, or a king further back in the past, would always supersede a newer charter unless in the newer charter it was explicitly stipulated that all, relevant older charters were being superseded by this new one. And so one of the effects of this was that in medieval charters you would often have this very complicated labyrinthine language trying to establish what was attempted to be established in the proper way. But also, another significant effect, and Kern in his book spends quite a bit of time discussing this, is charter fraud. People would forge charters and make them out to have been issued by emperors from long ago in order to try and secure privileges from the crown. So you would have people who would draw up fake charters and claim that it was issued by Constantine hundreds of years ago, or even by Julius Caesar. And you had this enormous industry of fraudulent charters. And of course, often people would get away with perpetuating these kinds of frauds because there were no records to really to speak of. Nobody really kept records. There was no bureaucracy in the state to speak of. So people would often get away with this. Now, the only records that really existed, and these records eventually served as the foundation of what later became codified law, because they contained the only examples where law, especially from legal charters, had actually been written down, were the libraries of various aristocratic families that had kept records, detailed, meticulous records of all of the royal charters that had been issued to them over the entire history of the family by every king and what everything specified, so that they could maintain their rights to their privileges, whether it be a certain stipend from the king, a certain amount paid to him, or a certain amount of livestock given away, or whatever it was. The point is that this complicated structure was maintained through these royal charters, many of which were fraudulent, and once they had been established, many people tried, desperately to maintain records of them so that they could keep their claims to them. There was also the fact that with the ascendancy of every new king, you had to renew your charter, so that made things more complicated. But what this is really, what this entire practice with these charters by these influential groups trying to confer favors from the state, what this is, and the word for this, of course, at the time didn't exist, but what we'd call this today, obviously, is lobbying. So lobbying existed even in the early Middle Ages. Even then, you had enormous groups of people trying to jostle for influence and trying to essentially make use of the state to steal, to get things that they did not earn from the state. So I have no intention of idealizing the early medieval state. It was quite a bit smaller and quite a bit weaker than the state at almost any time in history. However, there was corruption there even then. The state is born in iniquity and nursed in sin, so there's always going to be that. The whole purpose of the state is to run a racket and to steal, and so of course people are going to making use of that. So that's what I wanted to discuss with regard to medieval law. Now, moving on to this alleged inevitability of the state as founded within various Darwinian impulses or adaptations. In evolutionary psychology, or just in sociobiology in general, if you analyze something from an evolutionary perspective, if you see a certain trait that you wish to explain, you see a certain trait that has emerged in an organism that you wish to explain, from an evolutionary standpoint, there are three possible origins for that trait. Now, of course, all traits are held to have evolved, emerged through random mutation, but the point is that the trait was selected for any one of the following three reasons. One is that it assisted in the solving of some Darwinian problem, usually survival or reproduction, passing on of genes. The other is that the trait or the behavior is a byproduct of something else that did assist in the solving of a Darwinian problem, but is not necessarily strictly the same. It's just, sort of an incidental byproduct. And the third is just accidental. Now, that it just emerged accidentally, that it had neither evolutionary costs nor benefits to it, and so from the standpoint of survival and reproduction, it was neutral and just sort of stuck around. Those are the sort of three possible explanations. Now, when we go down this list, if we want to explain why it is that so many people throughout so much of history have believed in the state, I don't think that the first explanation is plausible. I don't see how you could reasonably contend that a state would allow people to solve some kind of Darwinian problem, to either survive or to more easily pass on their genes. For one thing, the state subsists through taxation, which is extortion. This means that they steal the property, the produce of other people. And especially, and this is less the case now because wealth is so much greater, especially in first world countries. But in ancient times, if the state taxed away one's agricultural produce, they would tax away whatever, meager amount they would produce over bare subsistence, and so the person would be, one bad harvest away from starving. I don't see how en masse this improves people's chances of survival. Also, there's the fact that states tend to be aggressive because since they subsist on taxation, they can externalize the costs of their aggression on other people and are therefore provided with an incentive to be more aggressive, to start wars. And wars, of course, in large, massive wars, I'm not talking about little tribal skirmishes, but in, gigantic, massive wars where large armies are mobilized, people tend to die. So I don't see how, except maybe for, the elite at the top, the existence of a state or the belief in the state by the majority of people in a society and the willingness to submit to it actually helps them in the solving of some Darwinian problem. The second possibility, that belief in the state is a byproduct of something else that perhaps did perform some legitimate evolutionary function. This, I think, is a lot more promising as an idea. So, I think it is definitely true that people tend to seek authority figures, but when they do, these authority figures tend to be people that they know, people that the person submitting to authority is familiar with. That sorry about this. They tend to be people that are in the immediate community or social group of the person submitting. Now, what I mean by this is that this is what tends to happen without prior ideology. So, unless someone is explicitly told that the state is a good thing, unless someone is explicitly told that without the state, society will collapse into chaos and so on, I don't see how it's plausible that people living in, say, Oregon would submit to the will of a gaggle of bureaucrats and politicians in Washington, D.C., who are thousands of miles away, who have never met them, who know nothing about them. If people are going to submit to authority figures, those authority figures are going to be people in their immediate environment, people that they know, whose character they have come to respect, whose, so on and so forth. In other words, the authority figures that people tend to naturally submit to the extent that they do, without any sort of prior overarching ideological influence, tend to be authority figures which are in what's called the Dunbar sphere or the monkey sphere of a person. So what this refers to is that in the ancestral environment for most of human existence on Earth, humans have tended to congregate in relatively small social groups of up to maybe 100 to 150 people or so. And this is really the largest amount of people that a human brain, because of the conditions in which it had evolved, can conceive of as people. That this social group of 150 people is really, the maximum size of a group with which you can maintain, seriously close, reasonably intimate human relations with. And so if people are going to submit to some sort of authority figure, it would tend to be someone within that Dunbar sphere that they know personally. And if you actually study the emergence of early states, this is sort of confirmed. See, first of all, before I even mention that, there is one gigantic hurdle to be overcome by the argument that submission to a state is natural, and that is the fact that for most of human existence, until about 10,000 years ago, humans lived in hunter-gatherer bands, and these were essentially stateless societies. So in the great majority of the time spent, you know, in existence on Earth, humans have lived without a state. States only began to emerge about 10,000 years ago, and if you study the emergence of these states tend to, the first states, ancient states, tend to only be able to take control of very small territorial areas right around their capitals. If they try to extend themselves any further, you get, if not outright resistance, then you at least have large cases of people simply ignoring the state. The tax man comes to collect, and people ignore him because they say, who, the king demands that I pay such and such? Well, he's, you know, tens or hundreds of miles away. Who is he? And in fact, you even saw this later in the wake of the collapse of the Roman Empire, when the Merovingian dynasty tried to centralize and create a state. You often had people who were, you know, people outside of their immediate capital that would just ignore their demands to pay taxes. It was very difficult to centralize power. Now, in the case of the Merovingians, and I'm only bringing up this particular case because it's one that I know well, in the case of the Merovingians, what allowed them to finally create and establish a state and centralize power is that they were able to spread this belief in the idea that the Merovingian dynasty itself had some kind of supernatural powers. So the Merovingian kings all had very long hair, and this hair was sort of viewed with a superstitious reverence. It was taken to be, it was taken to confer various magical powers upon the Merovingian kings, and throughout history, going, you know, much further beyond the Merovingians, there persisted a belief for a very long time that the King of France actually had the power to cure scrofula by simply touching someone. So what actually allowed kings, in not only in the situation that I've described, but just about everywhere else, to centralize power and to create states, was the belief by the people whom they were trying to control that these kings were either gods or were representatives of God, or given some kind of supernatural power or ability. You know, in the case of Egypt, you know, the Pharaoh was a god for the duration of his reign. So what this shows is that while it may be true that humans will naturally defer to authority figures within their Dunbar group of roughly 150 people, when anyone tries to form a large, you know, monolithic state, ideology is required in order to successfully centralize power. That ideology could be achieved through religion, you know, belief that the emperor is a god, or it could be achieved as it is now with the belief that the state is simply necessary for social order. And that brings me to a very important point. I think that today the state is only inevitable because people believe that it is necessary for social order. Now, of course, many writers, you know, that I'm not going to waste time naming, have done enormous amounts of work to try and demonstrate that every essential function of society, law, police services, defense, roads, etc., all public goods, all of this sort of thing, can and in fact has on many occasions throughout history been provided without a state. And not only has it been provided without a state, but it has been provided in a way that is more ethical, that is cheaper, that is more efficient, and that is more effective than the state-provided analog of this particular good or service. So it has been demonstrated through economic theory and so on, and through various allusions to historical episodes, that the state is not necessary for the maintenance of social order. However, most people believe that it is. Now, I don't see it as being reasonable to suppose that if this belief among people were to change, if they were to stop believing that the state was necessary for social order, that they would continue to support the state regardless. It doesn't make sense to me. Now, I'll give you an analogy. Imagine that you had been trying to convince a man to carry around on his back all day as he went about his daily business a 100-pound bag of sand. Now, if you simply came up to him and asked him to do this or told him to do this, he would laugh at you and tell you to go away. You would be ridiculed. Now, but suppose, on the other hand, that you had come up to this man and you had told him that if he did not carry this bag of sand around on his back all day, that God would strike him down, that God would kill him or whatever. And suppose that you successfully convinced him of this. Suppose that he actually came to believe it because of you. What do you think that this man would do? Obviously, he would pick up the bag and he would start carrying it around and struggling under its weight and, putting up with all the adversity necessary for doing so, but he would do it. He would do it if you were able to successfully convince him to do it. Similarly, if the God example is too extreme, suppose you were to convince him that if he did not carry this bag of sand around, his muscles would not be exerted sufficiently just on the basis of what he did normally throughout his day, and so because his muscles were not being put under sufficient strain, over time they would atrophy and get so weak as to make him unable to perform any kind of task, even a rudimentary task. And again, suppose that you convinced him that this was true. What do you think he would do? He would pick up the bag and he would start carrying it around. Now, suppose on the other hand now that someone else had come along and he had convinced him that these beliefs were false. Do you honestly believe that he would continue carrying around the bag? No, he would drop it and go about his life. And I think this is a perfect metaphor for the state. The state imposes an enormous burden on the society which it controls, through taxation, through regulation, through conscription into war, and so on. But, at least in previous ages, people believed that the existence of the state was divinely mandated, and so they accepted it. And today, they believe that the state is an absolute, sine qua non, completely necessary for social order. Now, this belief is false. I don't see it as being realistic to imagine that if people were convinced, if enough people were convinced that this belief is false, that they would continue to support the state regardless. And I don't think that appeals to any kind of natural Darwinian tendency to submit to authority figures overrules this, because, as I've explained, this Darwinian tendency only applies to the actual groups in which humans lived during the kind of an ancestral environment, which were very small groups of about 150 people or so. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that this is a serious danger for anarchists. Now, furthermore, just sort of a general comment. There is among some people, among some members of the YouTube community that I've noticed, that you see this among, for example, racial hereditarians. You might even see this among quite a few of the reactionaries and monarchists and so on, where they tend to look at biology and genetics and evolution and these kind of tendencies, and they sort of view them as sort of set forever. So a perfect example is this claim that I'm responding to, that because there is this Darwinian tendency, this evolutionary tendency among people to submit to authority, a stateless society, a functioning stateless society, is impossible. But it seems to me that one of the glories of humanity is our ability to resist these kind of naturally ingrained instincts. It's clear that of all living organisms that we know of, humans have by far the greatest ability to resist such urges. The instinct of self-preservation, to stay alive, is very strong, and yet you have people who willingly commit suicide. The instinct to propagate your kind and to have sex and produce children, that's very powerful. And yet you have people who choose to be celibate for ideological or religious reasons. Or you have something like men going their own way, that have essentially, because of their frustration with what feminism has done to society, have more or less chosen to eschew all sexual contact with women, or at least most of it. you don't have to endorse the movement, and I'm not saying whether I do or not, but the point is that its mere existence is, I think, a sufficient demonstration of the fact that people, for ideological reasons, can reject, can resist, can even overcome those sorts of Darwinian urges. I'm sure that if you go back sufficiently far in history, there are many writers, many people who thought that a woman's natural tendency was to be submissive to a man, and so if you proposed anything like modern feminism to them, they would laugh at it and think it was impossible and wouldn't last. And yet, here we are. So you don't have to express agreement with any of these movements to sort of see that they provide examples of humans being able to resist that sort of these kind of evolutionarily ingrained urges. Another example would be white nationalists. They see that fertility rates among white people are far too low, that they're below replacement level, and demographic projections lead them to what they take to be startling conclusions, and so they begin ideological campaigns to try and agitate against this. But the point is that if what is it that has made it so that fertility rates among white people are below replacement level? Well, it's largely ideological factors. It's things like the welfare state, which is maintained because of ideology. Feminism, again, which is maintained by ideology. All of these ideological factors. So the fact that this problem exists is itself proof that these desires are, even the strongest of evolutionarily ingrained desires, are possible to overcome. And if you can have things like this, if an example of overcoming that desire can be seen in white people today reproducing below replacement level, or in feminists, or in men going their own way, if ideology can influence them to overcome those natural instincts, then, assuming that some tendency to submit to a state even exists among people, if ideology can convince people to overcome all of those tendencies, why can't it be a sufficient motive to make people overcome this one, assuming it even exists, which, again, as I've argued, beyond a small scale, I don't believe it does. That sort of really gets me to the end of what I wanted to say. Now, I realize that there are further objections that you could make. You could possibly argue that the ideas which we only have for various Darwinian, biological, or evolutionary reasons. I don't think that this kind of outlook is plausible, and I sort of understood that this kind of objection might come, and in order to be able to answer it fully, I would have to make a foray into metaphysics, which I obviously would not have the time to do in any detailed way in this video, but suffice it to say that any kind of outlook that would posit that our ideas, that what we believe, are the product of various evolutionary and biological factors purely. This idea presupposes a materialist metaphysics, and this view of metaphysics is simply just not plausible. Very briefly, a philosopher by the name of Thomas Nagel, who's just written excellent stuff on philosophy of mind, has pointed out that the attempt to explain, let's say, consciousness, the phenomena of consciousness, by purely materialistic terms, purely in terms of reactions in the brain and so on, in terms of material phenomena, this cannot actually explain the substance of consciousness. The best that these explanations can do is that they can show that a certain event in the brain occurs, and that this event in the brain is correlated with a certain conscious experience. So, for example, I can sip wine out of a glass and taste it, and when I taste it, a certain event occurs in my brain. That event can be recorded and correlated with the tasting of wine. But even if we were to gain a complete knowledge of all material events that occurred in the brain, when we did various things, as we experienced various things, this would not be able to explain why our experience was of the character that it was, because there is something that it is like to taste wine. There is something that it is like to taste ice cream. There is something that it is like to, I don't know, anything you like. There's something that it's like to skydive or have sex or whatever. There's an experience associated with it. And even if you could map out the brain in materialistic terms completely and gain a complete catalog of information about it, and correlate each conscious experience to a particular physical event in the brain, this would not be able to explain why it is like what it is like, for that, why that experience is like what it is like, why you experience it as you do. Very well, you can say that a certain brain event occurs when I taste wine, but that doesn't explain why this particular wine tastes that way to me, and why, let's say, when you taste it, it's more sweet or more bitter or what have you. None of this actually explains the actual phenomena of consciousness, and so if you were to read the work of philosophers of mind that are materialists, like Paul Churchland or Daniel Dennett, when faced with this kind of problem, they eventually have to say, they're forced to say, in order to save their commitment to materialism, that conscious experience, what we think of as conscious experience, are just epiphenomena, that they are illusions. And I think this is plainly insane. So there are things which cannot be explained by a purely, materialistic metaphysic. There is consciousness, there are ideas, there are immaterial things. And this, I think, explains, why, or at least forms the beginning of an explanation of the fact that ideology can have an influence on humans. Ideas are, after all, non-physical things, and yet they motivate us to act. And I don't think it's plausible to explain these ideas in purely materialistic terms. You could say that I'm, by positing that minds or immaterial entities exist like this, that I'm multiplying entities beyond necessity, that I'm violating the principle of Occam's razor. I'm not. The whole point of an argument like Thomas Nagel's is that conscious experience cannot be reduced to material phenomena, to purely material phenomena, and therefore, in order to actually explain the stuff, the flesh of consciousness, you have to posit immaterial entities. So I'm not multiplying entities beyond necessity. That charge is false, just, in case it comes, because, I've thought of it. And there are other things, there are other problems. Just really quickly, Alvin Plantinga, the philosopher, who, by the way, Alvin Plantinga is a theist. Just because I'm endorsing his particular argument against materialism here, does not mean that I'm a theist, so please don't comment on this saying, oh, Alvin Plantinga, you must be a creationist. No, I'm not. Evolution, the theory of evolution is true, and by the way, Plantinga believes in evolution too. That's another thing. I just don't want to hear this creationist nonsense or anything about theism in general, because an endorsement of this particular argument does not imply a commitment to theism, even though Plantinga himself personally does use the argument that I'm about to describe to argue for theism. The point is that you don't have to, and on its own merits, it's still a very interesting argument. So Plantinga takes what he calls naturalism, and the term naturalism is defined by him in a very peculiar way. I've heard him say it like this. He defines it as the belief that there is neither a God nor anything like God. And what he means by anything like God is essentially just anything non-material. Platonic forms, immaterial minds, these kinds of metaphysical entities. And he says that if you believe in naturalism, in other words, if you're a materialist, basically, and if you believe in the theory of evolution, then you must believe that our mental faculties, that our minds, are also products of evolution. But if our minds are products of evolution, and if we come to our beliefs through the use of our minds, then that means that all of the beliefs that we don't have because they are true in some ultimate sense. We only hold them because they are evolutionarily adaptive to hold. Right? So all the beliefs that we have and all the faculties that we have, because they evolved, must be adaptive. That means that all of our beliefs are adaptive. But if all of our beliefs are adaptive, this does not imply necessarily that they are true. They might be true in some cases. Some true beliefs might be adaptive, but other true beliefs might not be. It might, be, dangerous to your survival to believe in something true. If you live under a fascist dictatorship, it might be dangerous to your survival to believe that the state is a violent and illegitimate entity that it is acceptable to physically resist, and so on and so forth. So a true belief does not. So the fact that a belief is adaptive does not imply that it's true. And this means if you believe in naturalism, and if you believe in materialism, or naturalism as Plantinga defines it, and if you believe in evolution, you cannot know with any certainty that any of your beliefs are true. And this includes all of your beliefs, including your belief in naturalism, your belief in that evolution is true, your belief in that the scientific method is a viable and valuable way to arrive at truth. Any belief whatsoever, since all your beliefs are formed by your cognitive faculties. So this whole thing is just kind of, shoots itself in the foot. And I think that this reason that Plantinga gives in his argument is another reason to believe that, immaterial minds exist, and that it is because of the existence of these immaterial minds, which are not subject to physical or biological law, that we are able to resist, that we have the capacity that we have to resist these kind of genetically ingrained or evolved tendencies. They're not perfect, we can't do anything, but the point is we have a capacity for resistance. And I think this leaves open the possibility that that anarchism could be viable. There are, of course, many other arguments you could present. You could say that that it is in fact true that a state is necessary for some level of social order or well-being, and you could say that if you look at all societies in which there is a state, they tend today to be much more materially advanced than the few stateless societies which exist, and so perhaps it is for this reason that people have consented to a state. I don't think that this is a reasonable argument, because it makes the correlation causation fallacy. It assumes that because there is a greater degree of economic, a greater degree of wealth, a greater degree of economic prosperity, and all of these wonderful material things that humans want, that the state is the cause of it. There's no evidence for that, at least not directly. And if we wish to compare a stateless society with a society in which there is a state, we should try to adjust as best we can for other factors, like technology, for example. It could be that just because of technological, pace or of technological growth, or the extent of scientific knowledge in a given society has allowed it to be more prosperous, and so on. So we have to adjust for these factors, and one way to do that, the best way that I know of to do that, is to compare the part of the United States which existed under a state with the so-called Wild West, the stateless, unincorporated territories as they were before they were incorporated. They had roughly equal standards of living. The stateless societies in the West did quite well. And also, if you examine certain things like crime rate, especially violent crime rate, in the stateless territories in the West, it was far lower than in the territories which were living under states. And that seems to imply that the law enforcement mechanism or the legal system of a stateless society of the sort that anarcho-capitalists propose tends to produce a society with less criminality. A society with less criminality is one in which you are more likely to survive and flourish, and so that may confer an evolutionary benefit to you of some sort. So you could actually make the counter-argument and say, no, it's not that states actually assisted in the solving of a Darwinian problem, it's that they hinder it, but there happen to be other factors that counterbalance it, and you can see this once you adjust for these factors. So, in short, I don't think that any Darwinian urges to submit to authority, to the extent that they exist, imply the existence of states, imply the inevitability of the eventual formation of states. I think that the formation of states requires explicit ideology, and that this ideology must be combated with explicit counter-ideology. That humans in the ancestral environment lived in small groups, and these groups are far too small to form anything like what we would call a real state, and that without explicit ideology, whenever larger states tried to form, people in fact resisted this, and that for most of human existence, up until about 10,000 years ago, they lived without a state. So there are plenty of reasons to think that this is not a serious impediment, that this Darwinian belief is not a serious impediment, and that even if it was, for various metaphysical reasons that I don't have time to go into, although I'm very interested in metaphysics and I have plans to make videos about the topic. I think philosophy of mind is a fascinating subject. But for various metaphysical reasons, ideas and sort of what you could call the mental realm, non-physical entities, are, I think, an irreducible part of human existence and of the world. And so even if these Darwinian urges were extremely powerful, this at least allows us the possibility of overcoming them through, once again, ideology. So I think that anarcho-capitalism is possible. The task for anarcho-capitalists, if they want to create the society that they would like to see, and if they'd like to maintain the society that they want to see, is to show people that the state is not necessary for the preservation of social order. And if people stop believing that the state is necessary for the preservation of social order, the state will stop being inevitable. People won't form it. They'll exist without it. And that's all I wanted to say. My phone is ringing, so I will end this video now, and that'll be the end of it. I'm finishing up a book on an interesting topic, and let me just say real quickly before I end this, I noticed a lot of the attention on my Hitler versus Pearl Harbor video. You've inspired these new subscribers that have come in have actually inspired me, of all things, to make an anti-Hitler video. The Nazi economic recovery. Oh, look at that! My phone stopped ringing. Oh well. The Nazi economic recovery was in fact a myth. Now I've decided I will definitely make a video about that at some point. It won't be my next video because I'm currently reading a book on a different topic, but I will make that because it's important. Just because Hitler did not declare war on the United States and did not want war with the United States doesn't mean I think he was any kind of wonderful guy, and doesn't mean that I think that any of his policies were in any way beneficial to the German people who lived under him. And that's all I wanted to say, and thank you for listening once again, and goodbye.